Our speaker is a UW professor, Marah Curtis, who has been on the faculty in the School of Social Work at UW-Madison since 2012. She is an associate professor and teaches courses on social policy and poverty. She will talk to us about what evidence there is about the causes of homelessness, the latest housing and urban development study on service delivery outcome for homeless families, and state and national strategies to address homelessness and the broader issues of housing insecurity. Welcome, Marah.
So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm quite pleased to be here. It is exciting always to get a chance to talk to different groups of folks about things that I think about every day for a living. So this is super neat. Now, I'm ever hopeful to keep my comments relatively brief. I have a really pretty tight agenda for what I hope we can do. Basically, I see my job as setting the context for thinking about housing instability and homelessness, and then having some time to chat and have questions. Because in this room, I know I have folks who work in the area, or folks who think about this also, or work in allied fields. And so I think the part that is most interesting is when you can take an evidence base and talk to folks about it and see how we can bring to bear what we know from research, different types of research, to what it is that we're all thinking about. So that's the hope. Okay. All right. Okay. So, housing stability and homelessness in the title, the way that I conceptualize this, and I want to just start out by framing this really quite clearly. Often people want to talk about homelessness, right? But you have to think about homelessness on the continuum of housing, right? So thinking about housing as a continuum from stably, consistently housed over time to homelessness at the other end, which is an extreme outcome. And somewhat rare, even if you believe that there are underestimates, which there are good reasons to believe that they are. Most folks who experience a spell of homelessness have experienced housing insecurity sometime before that, right? So if you want to think about homelessness and you don't take it up the chain, you do a disservice to the larger enterprise of doing so. So I want us to do all of those things today, rather than just thinking about the most extreme outcome, okay? Okay, so why do we care? Why do we care? What it means to be consistently, stably housed over time. Now think about your own lived experience. If you have had the experience of being consistently, stably housed over time, over your life cycle, that confers certain benefits to you. Housing is not just being free from being in the elements. It's a bundle of goods, things you get with it. The neighbors that you have, the schools that you can attend, the public goods that you have access to. And those are all things, if you're stably, consistently housed, you maybe don't think about, but they are direct inputs into a lot of outputs that we care about directly. So you need consistent, stable housing and the things attached to that bundle to actualize things that most folks care about. Labor market success, health, and education. Now, if you're going to think about housing stability and you're going to think about homelessness, you have to think about the fact of how we provide housing, how one gets their housing bundle in this country. So in the U.S., housing is largely provided in the private market. That's how we do things here. Okay? So what does that mean concretely? That means that families meet markets with a particular set of conditions at a particular price point at which they purchase their housing. Okay? The other thing to know about how we do housing in this country is that any kind of housing assistance for folks who are at the bottom of the income distribution is really very scarce. So far more people would be eligible for any income condition housing assistance like housing subsidies than ever do get it. So it's scarce. So those are the given conditions of the housing market, particularly for folks at the low end. And folks at the low end, short of homelessness, are the folks that we're talking about. Okay. Now, let's think about renters in the context of Madison. Okay? So if you think about the low end of the rental market, it is true nationally and true in Madison that the low end of the housing market is relatively tight. There aren't enough units for folks to afford at less than 50% of their monthly income. So that's a tight housing market. Madison is a tight housing market. We know this because we could look at things like vacancy rates, and we have relatively low vacancy rates, and our rents at the lowest end of the distribution are relatively high. Okay, so those are the given conditions of Madison. So if you take that given housing market and you say, okay, what are the implications for renters? Okay, so if you're a renter with perhaps poor credit or an incarceration record or inconsistent earnings, you're going to be relatively less attractive to those who rent the property at the low end. So you're facing a constricted market. It's tighter for you, right? That's the nature of being in a private housing market, okay? So those entering the housing market with challenges are going to have more difficulty leasing up, okay? Okay, so there's a lot of research in homelessness, like 40 years worth of it. There's an interesting way to think about the pots of research that think about homelessness as an outcome. There are different types of studies. There are studies that look at an individual family's incidence of experiencing homelessness, and those are one pot of studies. And there are another pot of studies that think about aggregate rates or rates of homelessness in a given city. And you use different methods to answer those questions. And so you want to be careful when you're thinking about the evidence base. So one thing I would say, if you were to summarize studies that look at individual incidences of homelessness, asking people whether or not they've experienced homelessness, and then having different things we think matter in that equation, okay? One thing to know is that personal characteristics, mental health issues, substance abuse, right? Those are not causally related to homelessness. They're associations, right? Okay. So if you look at two families that are exactly alike in all dimensions, and you place them in different housing contexts, if the one family in the housing context with a tighter market and less availability of regular income through supports, they are more likely to experience homelessness, all else equal, right? So that should tell you that a purely individual solution is not going to get you there because you're talking about kind of markets, right? So we can talk in a more specific way about different sorts of studies, and I hope we have a lot of time to mix it up and have some questions. But there are a couple things. Part of my charge here was to think about things that are happening in homelessness locally, right? And kind of bring to bear research around that. So I just want to do two things. The first thing I want to talk about here is the family option study. Now why? Why do I want to talk about the family option study? So this is a study that gives us good information about homelessness services provision and different things that folks can provide when they present themselves at a homelessness shelter, and how those outcomes are related, right? So this is a HUD-sanctioned study, and it's some of the best evidence, I would argue, that we have to date to understand the service provision aspect. What do we do, and how does this particular bit of service compare to this other bit of service? I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the study, and then we'll go from there, okay? So Housing and Urban Development sponsored this study. It's a randomized longitudinal study. So that just means that we're looking at people over time. You need time. You don't want to look at people at one point in time and think that you can know something about what's driving it. You want to be able to look at things over time. Okay? And randomized just means you're taking comparable families and they are in different conditions so you can compare their outcomes depending on what they get delivered. So that's the strategy here. So HUD commissioned this study to evaluate homeless services interventions with families and children. The other thing to know about homelessness, it's a state. Whether or not you are consistently and stably housed. That's all it tells you about someone. It doesn't tell you about the makeup of their family, whether they're an individual experiencing homelessness, whether they are a veteran experiencing homelessness, whether they are a family experiencing homelessness. That's another way of saying that those who get termed homeless are a real different, varied group of people, as we all are. So solutions are going to often vary based on that. So if you take one model of service provision that worked with X group, it would be a mistake to assume it should work with the next group when you're talking about services. Now, if you're talking about what it means to meet the housing market and whether or not you have access to it, anything you do to allow for more access to the housing market and to regularize the income of folks who are approaching that housing market, that's going to work for everybody. Okay? All right, good. Now, what did this study do? The Family Option Study enrolled participant families over the course of 2 years and followed them for 3 years. So it's about 2,300 families experiencing homelessness in 12 different sites across the nation. Okay? They were assigned to one of 4 different service conditions, and I'm going to tell you what those conditions are. Okay? They weren't assigned until after they already spent 7 nights in a homeless shelter. Now, this is a smart part of the design. Why? Because if you're in the shelter for 4 days or 5 days, and you could, as a family, resolve it using your support networks or other things you might have access to, you would have. So who you have left over then are families for whom being able to resolve the spell of homelessness was not within their range. Okay, so just to know who we're talking about here, okay? Now, the 12 different sites, 12 different cities across the country and sites that were working to roll out this study, okay, they varied across a whole bunch of dimensions. This really matters, right? So that you can understand whether or not it's suitable for whatever site you are in. So these different sites varied by geography, by population, and by the housing markets, so that you have some idea of how varied those situations are. So then you should know, like Madison should know, whether it's useful to borrow these sites based on the sites that were in this study, okay? Now, the one thing to say about this study, for those of you for whom you might be thinking, well, these weren't random sites. No, they weren't. I mean, you couldn't be a site if you weren't able to provide these 4 different arms, right? But that being said, these 2,300 families, their characteristics mirror the characteristics of homeless families nationally. So that's a good thing. That makes you feel better about the study design. Okay? So here are the 4 different conditions families could be assigned to. Usual care. All usual care means is if you presented yourself at a continuum of care at a homelessness shelter, that you would have access to whatever you would get anyway at that site. And the other, long-term subsidy, just like what it sounds like. A subsidy to hold your rental costs at 30%, okay? 30 cents on the dollar. That's a subsidy, long-term subsidy. Community-based rapid rehousing, and then project-based transitional assistance. I'm not going to get into the details of what these different things are, because for our purposes here, we're just going to look at the comparison between the subsidies and the other conditions, right? It's the purest test of what happens when you hold rental costs down for folks, what the outcomes are. Okay? So this study design allows for comparison between offering a priority preference, the ability for each one of these housing options, the subsidy, CBRR, PBTH, and usual care, as well as to one another. And I'm just going to focus on a couple there. This is a for those of you who like this sort of thing, the Family Options Study is like a 400-page report. I think it's really very interesting, and every one of those comparisons exists there, so whatever you are particularly interested in, you could go there and look just at those comparisons. There are many, many outcomes, many pairwise, comparing condition 1 to condition 2. I'm just going to focus on a few for the purposes of this, but no, it's rich. It's a rich data set and a little overwhelming, so if you go into it, know why you're there. Otherwise, you could lose yourself. Tell someone to come get you. Okay. So for our talk here, what I like to think about is that each one of those different conditions typifies or is the example of an approach to housing homeless families, an approach, things that we think work, based on a model of the world that we think is operating. We don't say that necessarily, but the approaches have that internalized in them. Okay? So each option typifies an approach to housing homeless families based on either explicit, stated theory about why families become homeless, and therefore the most effective service model. Again, it doesn't actually matter whether we explicitly say what we think we're doing in our service delivery models. Embedded in those models is a theory about how the world works. And so I think we should make everything that's implicit, explicit, put it on the table, take it out for a walk, see if it works, right? Right? Know what you're doing and be thoughtful about it. Okay. So comparing outcomes between those with priority preference for a subsidy, holding rental costs constant, versus usual care, just what you would get if you presented yourself to a homeless services agency, okay, is the clearest examination of subsidies on the well-being of similarly situated homeless families. Keep in mind, the entire sample are homeless families. So this can tell you what service provision does for homeless families. It doesn't tell you how families don't become homeless, because that's not the sample. That's a different question, right? Okay. Families who had access to usual care could also receive subsidies through their local homeless assistance agency. So what that means is when you're looking at the comparisons between usual care and a subsidy, they're going to be lower bound estimates. If you find anything, it's going to be lower, because some of the folks in your comparison group got subsidies on their own just by accessing the usual care. Okay, so those are going to be underestimates, anything that I show you. Okay? In fact, 37% of families that did not have a preference secured a subsidy. Like I said, any results comparing subsidies to usual care are going to be underestimates. So I'm going to show, yes, Families who received a subsidy remained housed, right? That's what they're supposed to do. They remained housed. But I'm talking here about a few other things. What's your non-housing impacts, right? Non-housing impacts of providing the subsidy. This is interesting, right? So at both 20 and 37 months after random assignment, household heads reported a significant decrease in psychological distress, a decrease in intimate partner violence, a reduction in the number of schools the focal child attended, and a reduction in the proportion of families that reported food insecurity. Now, this is not with any particular services to do so or not to do so. This is a relationship to the receiving the subsidy. That's a non-housing impact, okay? So, any benefits of subsidies, you would want to take account of other non-housing outcomes that you think are good things. Okay, so I have to do this, right? I was asked to talk about local strategies and national strategies, and so there are many things that we do when we think about housing. And so would I choose to talk exclusively about housing first? Maybe not, but this is what's happening in Madison, right? So I thought it could be useful to bring to bear what we know. So here's the last little bit, and then it's all about questions. Am I doing good on time? Okay. It's all going to be about questions and hearing what you have to say and what you think. Okay, so thinking here about international, national, and local strategies. The slide gets this title because Housing First is that. It's all these things. It's international, it's national, and now it's local. Okay? So when was Housing First developed? In 1992, so it's been around for a very long time. It was actually a psychologist in New York who was trying to get people into treatment, really hard to serve folks. And he kept going out on the street and saying, hey, come into treatment, we can do this, come into treatment. And people didn't want to do it. And then he said, wow, maybe I should get people housed, right? So that was the impulse for Housing First back in New York City, okay? It rapidly spread throughout the world. It's the dominant method for dealing with chronic homelessness. I was at a lecture on homelessness, a conference on homelessness in Australia a couple years ago, and I had the good fortune to listen to a national researcher talk about all of the research on Housing First across the entire EU, North America and the EU. So it's been around for quite a while. So that means there should be results, okay? So here's the first thing to know about Housing First and the implementation of Housing First. On one slide, these are the things that are common when Housing First is rolled out across nation, okay? Fidelity to the model. Is your housing first my housing first? Is your housing first her housing first? What is it, right? So a lot of the research is concerned with fidelity to the model, how well it carries out the principles of Housing First, which then of course may impact your outcomes, okay? And this idea, it's not a bad thing or a good thing, it's just something to pay attention to. There can sometimes be resistance from service providers, because in some ways it's a different way of doing business depending on what they were doing before, okay? And then there are concerns about receiving neighborhoods, not very different than what is called NIMBYism. People get concerned about the placing of Housing First units in neighborhoods. This is not new. Any place that does Housing First has had to contend with this. So looking to nearest neighbors is always helpful to you. It has been common over time, I would argue, that these concerns are mediated over time with experience with the program and buy-in. But these things, you have to give a window of time for them. Okay, so what do we know in terms of research? There's actually randomized controlled trials of Housing First. And so I'm going to just quickly talk about what they find, okay? So what is the original Housing First? Okay, and what are these randomized controlled trials of this telling us? Okay, the Housing First randomized control trials, what they do is they take Housing First, the two different conditions are Housing First as conceived with fidelity to the model, or standard treatment, whatever you're going to get in that particular geography. Okay, and then these folks are followed for varying amounts of time, and the outcomes of the two groups are compared. That's the strategy, pretty straightforward. Okay. And so in terms of housing outcomes, what do these studies find? In 11 out of 12 RCTs, Housing First produced greater housing than treatment as usual. You would hope so, right? It's called Housing First, so it does do that, okay? The differences are often very large. So for example, there's a Canadian multi-site study with about 1,200 participants. The treatment group were housed 63 to 77% of the time following random assignment, compared to the control group that was housed 24 to 39% of the time. Okay, so that's a significant difference in the two groups. Okay? Now, that's a housing outcome. They also looked at other outcomes. Now, this body of research is much more mixed. Okay? Results on health and functioning are more controversial, and these vary by study. Okay? Some studies find a positive impact of the Housing First program on the control of HIV transmission, alcohol use, and community functioning. And many find no significant effect. But here's a little bit of context. I think this is interesting. Housing First as treatment does not perform more poorly than programs that prioritize treatment. So that's an interesting thing to consider. Okay. So, oh, good. Right. Just to sum up these few bits of studies that we've been talking about. I would argue, and the research suggests, that evidence supports that Housing First approaches can reduce the length of time an individual experiences homelessness and may improve functioning. So we know about the first, and it may improve functioning. Okay? Evidence supports that subsidies to homeless families stabilize housing and reduce child school moves. There are also other non-housing impacts that you would want to consider when you're considering a cost-benefit analysis or the value of extending subsidies. Okay? Now, these are my last remarks and then questions, okay? There are only 3 things on this slide, and each one of them is a whole big pot to think about, so I'm just going to touch it, and if it's interesting to people, we can talk more. This idea of thinking about housing stability over time, and I mean over a family's life cycle, is really very important. And there are many ways that you can think about housing stability through income stability that lays in many different parts of our social welfare state. So anything, I would argue, any lever you can think of that regularizes income allows families to weather shocks, changes in health, changes in wealth, and changes in their functional capacity. So any capacity to do that allows families to figure out how to stabilize. One thing we also know is that sometimes very small increments of money allow families to stabilize very quickly. You're never going to see them at the homeless services shelter because they were able to resolve it with a small infusion. So thinking about how regularizing income is going to help you up the stream with regularizing the ability to remain housed. Issues of scale. What I mean by this is we find these results in these different studies, but from a policy design perspective, how do you scale it up? Do you just give a bunch more subsidies and then you flood your market and then maybe costs go up? Probably not. No, not probably an awesome way to do it. So how you design your subsidies, if that's your route, you have to be thoughtful about it. You have to be thoughtful about it. And it's not obvious to me that other kinds of income transfers might not make more sense, but that's a policy design question, okay? And this last idea that people meet markets. So in a conversation, I don't want you to have conversations with anybody about homelessness if we're only going to talk about people who are experiencing homelessness. It's not the right way to think about it. People meet markets. So their individual characteristics, whatever challenges people may be facing, sure. Okay? But that does not a housing market control. Right? You meet those housing markets. And so you can want to mediate the most negative effects of homelessness, and there's good reasons to do that, because any spell spent homeless imparts unique advantages beyond the advantages that folks may enter that state with. So there are good reasons why you want to do something about that. But you don't want to confuse what you observe with a causal story. Can I end on that? Questions? We have time for questions? Okay.
Yes. Hi. One of your last points was the relationship between health outcomes, HIV, alcoholism, all sorts of different things, and you said that it was about equal in terms of getting the same effect from actual focus treatment programs on those characteristics and just stability in housing. What would you say then in terms of just doing the providing of housing will in turn, is that a causal relationship? And can we say that if we just focus on that first, we can eliminate a lot of the programs that we have to deal with the Band-Aid approach then?
So that's a great question. And yes, that slide thinking about the impacts on treatment and the impacts of subsidies. Yes. So does that mean, so I'm going to reframe and you tell me if I'm reframing properly. Do we cash out all of our programs and give people subsidies? Is that, okay?
We can't go that far, but how far can we go?
Yeah, well, so that's a good question. We don't know. So the best evidence is that we know across all different sorts of studies that subsidies have the effects that I've shown, but that doesn't mean that the design implication is that you cash everybody out necessarily. So I think we don't know what the optimal design is, but I think all of the research points to the idea that stabilizing is important. The trickiness comes in if you're talking about a particular geography, and let's say you dump a bunch of subsidies into the market, what that might do to the market. That's kind of almost theoretical. There's some research about whether or not it might crowd out other availability of housing, but we've never tried that. So what's the optimal design? I don't know. Nobody quite knows yet. But I think that's the direction you want to go in. And I would encourage it not just to be thinking about, so housing subsidies, because it forces you to use the money on housing, but I could imagine other scenarios that produce housing that is affordable that might also do the same thing. We just haven't quite thought about it that way. So this is a room of folks who build things and do things and run things. Think about it, figure it out, and then we can test it, see if it works. Yeah.
Thanks for opening the discussion. My experience has been that a lot of times for housing to be affordable, it's moved far away from the center of town. And then that raises the unanswered question of then how do the people off at the edges get back to the jobs and the child care and the health care and the schooling assets. Madison, in my experience, has a huge blind spot of the need to connect housing and transportation and mobility access. What does your study say about that? And if it doesn't, how can we start talking about houseportation?
So what's your name? Karen. Karen. So Karen, the conversation that you're having about, well, no, but so now you're talking to everybody here, and then you should talk to everybody every place you go. So I would say that the core issue there is about, so whoever your affordable housing sector operators are, that maintaining housing close to work is then the issue. That generally comes down to, if you use any kind of, if you use the low-income housing tax credits, developers use that to get stuff developed. There's usually a real strong trade-off about how many units are affordable and affordable at what point in the income distribution. So to me, the core of your question is keeping the housing in the central cities, or I'm assuming that's where the jobs are. And so the negotiation happens before you worry about the people being too far from the jobs. There would have to be a commitment at a city level to ensure that you have enough of your stock affordable to folks at some percentage of the income distribution. So I think it comes down to the siting and the deals, the LIHTC deals, and the proportion of the number of units that are affordable at the lowest part of the distribution. So in cities, so I'll give you an example. So in cities that are incredibly expensive cities like San Francisco, they got to a place there where they didn't have anybody earning less than like $150,000 who could afford to live anywhere. So their teachers and their firefighters are living like an hour and a half away, and guess what? They can't get back in time to put out a fire or teach kids. Not awesome. So a city would have to decide that it has a commitment to maintaining some kind of income diversity because it's believed that it's part of how a place thrives. So yes, I know that this is the problem, and this is the problem reported nationally. I think the people who think about that should be at the table with the people who are negotiating the LIHTC deals and the proportion of the stock that remains affordable. So now you have another job. Talk to
We're going to go over here and then back over to Paul.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name's Joan Ziegler, and I have a question because lately I've been reading in the paper about some of the low-income housing and trouble with police and stuff like that, and it seems like it's collected, and I know there was a lot of tax incentives to include affordable housing in development projects so that they were more spread out and not all collected in one spot, which has been proven unsuccessful as far as I can tell in the past. I mean, a lot of the projects in high-density low-income housing has really struggled or been removed. Seems like it's coming back. What's happening? I don't know, what are we going to do about that? I mean, obviously it doesn't work to collect everybody low income in one spot. How do we see that those subsidies given not just to Section 8 housing and to other things that kind of group it up?
Well, so a good question. Sure, we have quite a bit of research that concentrating poverty is not a great idea. But think about it this way, right? So affordable housing can go up into the income distribution, right? So income mixing at the city level or at the local level, I think that is where the future is headed. So there is kind of mixed income housing initiatives that are almost proof in concept. What does it look like to actually have an income diverse neighborhood? So thinking about building that rather than the idea of how many poor folks can you put here without people flipping out and flight and all the rest of it. I mean, you know, these seem like arguments from like 30 years ago. I think we have to start thinking differently. So yes, sure, concentrating poverty, not an awesome idea, but that goes to the structure of your subsidies. That goes to what you do, right? And there are places across the country, particularly tight housing markets, where you have middle income housing and higher up, right? So I think those strategies, to me, have legs and arms. They swim.
My name is Paul Riemann.
Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk and your energy. I have two questions. The first one, you talked about income. And what about a living wage as a minimum wage and as a factor, because subsidies are one thing, but earning it is another. So if you'd speak about that. And then the second question, I'll preface with a quote from Abraham Lincoln, who said, public sentiment is everything. With it, everything is possible. Without it, nothing is possible. So if a living wage is part of this, then what are your thoughts, and how do we become a model in Madison, possibly even in the state, because we have a progressive governor, to test this, to do pilots, because we want sustainable solutions?
So thank you for the question. So what I can say is that, of course, access to regular and sufficient income has all kinds of potential good things attached to it. That is somewhat separate from the narrow research about homelessness or housing insecurity, right? So how does a city become a model city for a living wage? You decide to do it. And then you have your flagship university and you figure out how to evaluate it. I mean, you just decide that you're going to do it. Are there potential downsides to that? I mean, I don't know. You'd have to think about it. I'm personally not going to have any downside to people being properly paid, but there have not been any impacts of increases in minimum wage having any kind of labor market effects. We've never found any impacts of that. So you're asking a philosophical question, right? And you're asking, can we be a model? I think that Madison can be whatever it chooses to be if it chooses to do so. And you certainly have the chops to evaluate anything we choose to do. I would never argue against regularizing income and sufficient wages. Now, Madison is a story of a tight housing market and low vacancy rates, but Milwaukee is a story of relatively, there's plenty of housing there, but the wages aren't sufficient to even afford housing that is beneath fair markets, right?
If you had to pick between a living wage or subsidies, which and why?
So I wouldn't frame it that way. I wouldn't pick either or, because I want to feel open to the idea that there are, so we're talking about transfers, right? Whether it's a subsidy or whether people are earning more. Why not open it further? Why not open it further? Right? You understand? Yeah. Other countries do other kinds of income transfers, you know. They've managed to remain. We could do that too.
This will be our last question.
Hi, over here. Madison has two Housing First programs on Rethke and Tree Lane. Rethke's working, Tree Lane has had a number of problems. Is that unusual? Did the city do something wrong? And what strategies do you have for addressing it?
Well, I can answer the first one, but the second two, I would have to leave to people who are actually working in it. I can tell you what the research says. I don't know whether Madison did anything right or wrong. I don't know the model, and I don't know how much fidelity there is, but these concerns that you express and the energy with which you express them are not unheard of, and they're common in many places where you have Housing First. That doesn't answer the specificity of this, what's happening here. And I'm sure there's people in the room who have direct experience of it that I don't, so I would defer to answer that. But writ large, internationally and nationally, these are not unusual concerns. There it is.
Thank you to Professor Curtis. I'm sure she will be up here if you have any questions that we didn't get to. And remember, the whole Jason thing stays in this room. We are adjourned.